Hi everyone, and welcome to Innovator Capital's Clean Equity webinar. I'm Hanna, and for those of you who don't know us, we're Innovator Capital, a London-based corporate specialist advisory firm working with early stage technologies in the space of sustainability and life sciences. Founded by Prince Albert II of Monaco, together with Mungo Park, chairman of Innovator Capital, Clean Equity is a yearly conference that is focusing on accelerating the development of early stage sustainable technology companies. A couple of quick housekeeping notes before we go into the session. This is being recorded, so you will be able to watch this back on demand on the Clean Equity website, as well as on EarthX, which is today's broadcasting partner. A big welcome goes out, especially to those of you who are joining us via EarthX right now. And if you are joining us via Zoom, please make sure that you use the Q&A feature just below to ask any questions that you might have for the panelists, and we will try to get to as many as possible of them. So this Clean Equity webinar series takes a closer look at sustainability from the perspective of the investment sector and technology innovation. In the first session, this one, our panel will be exploring the role of the investment sector and technology in achieving a sustainable food supply chain. Moderating the session today is Thad Simons, founder and managing director at the Yield Lab. The Yield Lab is an accelerator program designed to enable entrepreneurs to sustainably revolutionize agri-food systems by investing in high impact and early stage companies from around the world. So thank you very much for being here with us today. I hope you enjoyed the session, and I'm handing over to Thad.
Well, hello everyone. Thanks Hanna for setting this panel up. I think it should be a very interesting, exciting time. I very much welcome everyone's participation and remind you about the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. And the first panelist I'd like to introduce is Jayne Brookman. Jayne?
Hi, so my name is Jayne Brookman. I'm a biochemist by training, and I've worked at the junction between research and business for the last 20 years, and most recently in my role as director of the Northwest Europe regional office of a big EU-funded program, Eit Food. Thank you.
Thank you, Jayne. Next up is Joshua Hope.
Hi there, thanks, Thad. My name is Joshua Hope, and I'm an investment associate at Earth Capital. Earth Capital is a thematic investor that invests within sustainable growth equity and infrastructure investments around the world, predominantly looking at the challenges faced by energy, food and agriculture, as we'll be looking at today, and water. Earth Capital is a fund management group focused in Europe, Asia, and Africa, with $1.6 billion of assets under management, and I'm looking forward to the session.
Thanks, Joshua. And now we'll have Tasha Tucker join us, representing the entrepreneurs in the audience. Thanks, Tasha.
Yeah, thank you, Thad. Yeah, my name is Tasha Tucker. I'm the CEO and founder of Olympia. We are an agricultural tech company based in London, specifically focused on pollination and future technologies to create sustainable pollination systems. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. I think all the panelists can come back in on their video. Very good. So again, people who are joining, please note the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. For the moment, we're going to jump in with some of our questions that we've been thinking about over the past few days. And a lot of it really has to do with the trends that we're seeing with regard to the food supply chain. And so I wanted each of the panelists to have a chance to kind of give their kind of indication of what they see as the major trends that are developing along the food supply chain. So we can start with Jayne, and then we'll go in the same order in which we were introduced. Jayne, Joshua, Tasha.
Thanks, Thad. When thinking about this, I think you have anything that you can measure and anything that you can get information from that enables you to make decisions. I think that's any sort of, and that's going to cover a very wide range of technologies probably. But I'm thinking about pen-side diagnostics for infectious diseases. I'm thinking about ability to measure carbon in soils. I'm thinking about ability to measure soil health, any ability to model, for example, digital twinning of modeling of supply chains or of processes. So I think those are the types of areas, technology areas, that are really going to be coming through in the next sort of few years. So it's that measuring, using that measurement, transporting that measurement probably from one area to another within your business, and any of the platforms that were involved with that, and making sensible decisions based on those measurements.
Thank you. Joshua?
I think that there are a number of really, really interesting points, and particularly one that Jayne raises about monitoring and measurement. And that's certainly supply chain traceability is something that we've seen a lot of within our pipeline, and a number of companies with very interesting platforms that allow all users and stakeholders within the supply chain, all the way from farm to fork, to be more integrated, to respond more flexibly to changes in supply and demand. So that's something that we're certainly seeing, and that's a key trend that I'd highlight as well. I think the other two technology trends, one kind of less so on the technology side, but that being of higher yield production, so predominantly coming from vertical farming through the form of aeroponics, hydroponics, or indeed simpler greenhouses. And I think that's something that's really being driven by this want for decentralized production that's not necessarily at the risk that our kind of fairly homogenous global food network is at, particularly when you look at the risks associated with climate change and the risks to those supply chains. And you only have to look at the impact the coronavirus has had for many countries that heavily rely on imported food over the past 9 months or so. And that's only going to be indicative of the impact that climate change is going to have on such heavily integrated networks in the decades to come. And I think the last very interesting area technologically is alternative proteins. That's certainly an area that we've seen a huge amount of, and that covers quite a broad spectrum, anywhere from alternative meat products for human consumption. But I think actually a niche in the market that's only becoming larger is actually alternative proteins for animal consumption, and that's particularly an area that has its own significant food chain and has a large impact associated with it from a natural capital perspective that really needs kind of a really good level of investment into. So those are the three areas that we at Earth Capital and I'm particularly excited by.
Thank you. Tasha?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, and one thing that we enjoy doing is really looking at an interdisciplinary kind of approach. So the combination of looking at fields that are maybe outside of the kind of food supply chain and your kind of traditional way of thinking, and bringing in, a different perspective on these ideas, and kind of stretching outside of the norm of what we think goes into the food supply chain, or even in something as small as pollination or farming. I think I agree with Joshua that as we start to look at high yield production and indoor growing, there's going to be challenges that we need to start to tackle with how do we kind of make a normal sort of system within those. So how do we start to provide water and pollination and all these sort of things within that sort of context, and being able to take a much broader kind of nuanced approach to it. I think we'll start to see a bit of a deeper dive into the data that we're able to collect, the monitoring that we're able to do, how we present that information to farmers, and what that really means at the end of the day to production and yield quality and food supply for the future.
Thank you. I want to go a little bit deeper into what Josh was talking about around decentralization. So I think we've seen over the past 100 years increasing scale in agriculture. Increasing scale, larger is better, more centralized, more globalized is better. but maybe there's a contrary trend now. You mentioned several reasons why there could be seen the contrary trend, both in terms of COVID and climate change. But I think the other question I would like to explore a little bit is, what does that mean with regard to farming, capital required for farming, and farmers themselves? So is it going to mean that we're going to be able to go back to smaller farms, less capital, more because information becomes cheaper, and therefore access to markets maybe is cheaper than it was before and don't require all the consolidation and distribution that we put into place before?
Would you like me first again, Thad? So I think that I don't disagree with Josh in terms of there is going to be decentralization, but I possibly maybe would disagree slightly in the scale of that. I think that you could imagine for high value crops that you might well end up with a decentralized production system. You could end up with, as you say, urban farming, vertical sort of production, mixed models where you're going to be looking at converting waste into feed for fish, for example, across the front of buildings. And I think there's going to be probably a real mixture of those types of opportunities, and they probably will be much more associated with the places that people live rather than the countryside. But I still think we're a long way off from large scale production of commodity goods in cities, basically. And I don't know whether, I mean, possibly we will get to that point at some time in the future, but I think that's going to be a way away. But I think you could imagine for very large markets of higher value goods, you know, like your salad crops. There's some very, very good examples of brown land development, thinking about places like in London. Thanet Earth produces large amounts of peppers and tomatoes, for example, out of greenhouses that are on reclaimed land. But I would say that I think the arable farmers of the Midwest are probably fairly safe for the time being. I do think that there probably will be a split, though, between you know, they're not making any more land, so you know we can't keep expanding in that way. So I think there are going to be changes, and I think that if you're going to cite those changes somewhere, you might as well do it whereby you can maximize the proximity to the markets. And so you know, I think that will have implications for who considers themselves to be farmers in the future. You know, it could well be that you do end up with a different breed of farmer, not just the people who consider themselves custodians of the countryside, but you might have a new breed of farmers in that way. So, and that's going to have obviously impact in terms of the capital cost and the types of farming that would take place. Do I think it's going to get smaller? Probably not. That would be my view. I think if anything, with some of the urban units, you may well end up with a split in the same way that you do in food manufacturing, for example, where you have many smaller units and then consolidation of really, really big companies would be my opinion.
Yeah, I would have to agree with Jayne. I think you know, this kind of split between some of the smaller market areas. We can look at partnerships like Driscoll's Berries and Plenty that just announced the kind of indoor strawberry farming partnership a few months ago. You know, and that's really dealing with how do we grow outside of salad greens and vegetables, kind of into berries and things inside. And what that kind of means for the market, and starting to see some of the larger cooperatives and larger players in that area starting to look at this nuance. You know, I think will be a trend that continues to grow. You know, I definitely still think we'll have some of the larger, more centralized farms, of course, and especially in arable, as Jayne was saying. But I think we'll start to see much more of a blend between these two kind of ideas and concepts of bringing farming to market.
I completely agree with your sentiment, Tasha, about a balanced approach. And I think that if you just look at the pressures on the food supply chain from one end to the other, with climate change increasing pressures on soil quality, water resources and significantly more climate stress in certain regions of the world on the one hand, that's going to have a big impact on yields of traditional arable farming techniques. And then on the other side of that, we're as a global population going to increase by anywhere between 2 to 3 billion by the end of this century. So we've got pressures on both sides, and something's got to give. We've got to increase scale of production in a number of areas, and that's the traditional methods have got to increase their production yields, and we've got to get smarter in different ways, I think. And to some extent, I think decentralization does provide an answer in some cases, but I think that there are a number of regional aspects that are quite interesting here. I guess to draw an example of the work that we're doing at the moment, we've had a lot of interest in raising and committing capital to solutions, particularly in the Middle East, that have typically had to import significant amount of food. And that's only going to be an increasing issue moving forward. So some sort of domestic production, particularly of fresh fruit and vegetables, is very important to have that security over their supply chains and shortening the number of effectively points where the chain can break in between. So I think that's something that we're going to see a lot more of, and smarter supply chains as well. I think there's not traditionally hasn't been that much redundancy within supply chains, and I think that if their redundancy is built in through better data, through better analytics, then that can also help the more traditional longer supply chains to be more resilient to shocks that will help that this balanced approach really to work with the pressures that's going to see over the years to come. And I think that there's a wide range of capital that's going to be funded into that, into both areas moving forward.
So one other piece I wanted to go a little bit deeper on with regard to your last comment, Josh, is the sources of capital. So farming traditionally has not been that attractive to many of the financing that happen in venture capital or private equity or in these areas. But now we have these new phenomena. We talked about indoor farming, we talked about alternative proteins, and it seems to be getting a lot of attraction to new sources of capital. Maybe that's worth exploring just a little bit as we close off this part of our discussion.
I think it's quite an interesting point, because these are actually, in a way, they're where traditional farms are almost infrastructure projects in a way, whereas actually at the moment we're almost looking at high growth tech companies. So it's a very, very different type of company that we're fundamentally looking at, whether it be companies that are very interested in the tech or the IP to do with new types of nitrogen fertilizers or anything else within the supply chain that's been mentioned. So I think that there is a lot of interest from the investment sector within this, and we've seen that with lots of ag tech funds being launched, more increasing support at the incubator level as well. But I think that the financial sector is beginning to get it at the other end as well. And I think one interesting example more recently is Barry Callebaut, who is one of the world's largest manufacturers and sources of cocoa beans, and they recently have the advantage of being able to be vertically integrated within their supply chain, to have management over their different suppliers and growers. But they set a series of sustainability targets for their supply chain, including farmer education, ensuring appropriate wage levels throughout the supply chain, particularly for their West African cocoa bean growers. And they launched a revolving credit facility that was then linked to the company's sustainability index through the data provider Sustainalytics. So I think that there are both interesting parts kind of the capital spectrum that are moving more to focus on this area. I think that's something that the investment sector is getting. I think Earth Capital's been quite good at that traditionally. We've got an in-house framework that we use to monitor and then report that. But that's increasingly being a focus for other investors as well.
Great. It was a great segue into the next area, which is sustainability. And so how we can drive sustainability goals more into our investments and also into the companies that we're looking from the investment. So I think you definitely from the Earth Capital point of view, but also I would like to hear perspectives from Jayne and Tasha on that.
obviously, if you think about Eit Food, the company that I represent, we basically we take the choice of only really supporting companies that align themselves to our goals. So whilst that may seem to be a somewhat selfish sort of approach, obviously if you provide support with a very clear outline of saying, you know, we will only support new companies or early stage companies that actually align themselves with our sustainable development goals, then basically you sort of progress your own opinions and but more or less by actually ignoring the other people. So I don't know whether that's necessarily the right way to go, but that's one that we actually take the view that we should develop. So what we do is basically we insist upon people's viewpoints being similar to our own before we consider investment in them, and we can do that through a variety of sort of approaches, really, in terms of we specifically ask them to engage with us in terms of saying in what way do you align your aims and objectives with ours, and also how do you feel that the technology that you're developing will fit in to this new world of sustainable development of the food system.
Yeah, I think from a small startups perspective, it's been really interesting over the last few years to see the kind of incubators and accelerators that are coming along and kind of supporting companies within this area. It gets a bit tricky, I think, when it comes time to sustainability and really disruptive or innovative technology, something that's quite unique, because then you start to go into an area where you may not be familiar with investing in agriculture or ag tech, but then you also have this really kind of off the wall or a different way of thinking about the approach to the challenge, and being able to get investment and kind of find that capital and making sure that you're hitting the milestones that are on a bit of a different scale than what maybe some of your other companies may be experiencing. It's almost a deep tech or a different kind of time frame, especially when it comes to farming and growing seasons. So striking that balance between hitting kind of investment milestones and those kind of things and getting the investment in, but also still truly being disruptive or trying to push the kind of envelope of the way that we're thinking and bringing these products to market can be a bit of a struggle for startups sometimes.
And Josh, do you have anything more to add to what you said before?
I mean, I think that investors are slowly getting it, if that's fair to say. I think Tasha would be in a better position to say as the one trying to pitch to investors. But I think that there is this gradual shift towards people really being able to price in what does sustainability mean. And I think just to give an example of what we do, we have our framework that's a proprietary measuring tool that's called our Earth Dividend. And in effect, we measure companies in a scorecard approach that we would be looking at to bring into our portfolio. And we measure them against a number of questions that are across society, governance, ecosystem services, pollution, etc. And we measure them, and if that makes a certain cut, and our chief sustainability officer has a vetoing power over our investment committee, over any investment decision that we make, we'll bring them into our portfolio. And then we'll work with that company throughout that period in order to increase its value, both from a core financial perspective and to identify areas in where we can really add value sustainably and move that forward. So I think that's a really, it's an example of how we price in the sustainability inputs that we're looking at. And I think that is how the financial sector is moving and fundamentally needs to be moving too. We only need to look at the amount of capital that needs to be allocated in order to transition our current food supply chains, for instance, to integrate sustainable technologies in order to meet the large national and international decarbonisation targets and sustainability targets that we have.
So Jayne, were you?
I had an interest in what you said there, Joshua. And do you actually engage with your prospective investments to actually say, you know, you're getting almost there, but we would really appreciate it if you could think about it from a slightly different angle and do it that way? Because I know one of the things that we find often is that when we're engaging with people, they're very technology focused, and they sometimes don't even think around what the implications are going to be. And it's not that they're necessarily doing things in the wrong way, they're not thinking about them in the right way that enables them to take the right path.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really pertinent point. And I'm trying to think of an example here. I don't think you should ever have red lines if those exist. You know, there are red lines in terms of, you know, you wouldn't invest in certain sectors, but certain aspects of the company's doing, we would always look at from a holistic perspective, and that's really the aim of the Earth dividend, is that you're not just looking at carbon footprinting or an impact on a certain SDG, for instance. It's all about that kind of holistic perspective, and also measuring. You know, we measure both positively and negatively, and I think that's really important, because if you're just measuring on a positive scale and you're talking about the positive side of things, then in a way you're very quickly going down a route where the kind of the G word, the greenwashing word, starts to come up. And I think that it's very important that you're actually telling the story completely as it is. You know, if a company isn't as sustainable as it could be, you should be reporting that warts and all, and you should be helping that company to define targets and define milestones in order to reach a defined output. And you should be measuring that in the same way I was talking about Barry Callebaut earlier and their facility that they'd raised. I think it was a $700 million or million euro facility. The cost of that facility, you know, the interest rate was linked to their sustainability index. And I think that that's the way in which both, you know, to take us as a relatively small private equity investor versus a large conglomerate, it's all about how we price in and reflect the incremental benefits that we're trying to achieve, and that ultimately we have empirically seen gives us better returns from a financial side. And I think that's the final point, is that we're talking about sustainability here, but actually the core points of being a PE investor, you know, working in the venture capital space earlier on in the value chain, the core principles still apply. We're still looking for, you know, interesting technologies that fill a specific niche, fantastic management teams that have a clear strategy. Do the returns match? Are they higher than our cost of capital? All the above still apply, but we're looking at it through a filter that's going to be resilient for the next 10, 15 years to come. And with that mind of actually what's the buyer of the company that we're about to invest in 5 years' time going to be thinking about, because that's going to be a different world.
Yeah, the technology director of a large own brand manufacturer once said to me that doing sustainability measures has never ever cost them a penny. It's actually helped them. Yeah.
And I think that's right. I think what people just mostly don't do is they don't look at, they don't measure or put a sustainability goal or lens against what is otherwise just good business practice. So if we go back and look at our supply chains, I had this when I was CEO at a multinational company, and it was like, all right, we're going to increase the efficiency of our supply chain by changing our delivery schedule and how the trucks are going out. But we never look in terms of what impact that has with regard to less fuel, less tires, less, you know, all the other impacts that are there that are themselves measurable, but we don't really take the effort to measure them. And I think today what we're seeing is it's easier. The tools are there, the sensors are there, the reference points are there. So there are a lot of things that weren't there 10 years ago that today are there, making this much easier. There is one question over in the chat. So if, and I would encourage the audience to use the Q&A feature, and as questions come in, we will try and address them. So if the panelists will just have a look at that, it has more to do with the processing side of things. And I keep coming back in my mind to the example Josh gave us of Barry Callebaut, because a lot of this has to do to me with the whole supply chain. We're talking here about the food supply chain. So we should be talking beyond the farmer. And where's the real, where is the burden sharing going on as we're trying to drive to more sustainable farming practices? What responsibility really belongs to the rest of the food system, to the Barry Callebaut's of the world, to the Walmarts of the world, or Tesco's in your part of the world. So who is really responsible? Because most of the value is not created on the farm. Most of the value is created in the food system. And that's where most of the value then comes in terms of dollars or pounds. And how do we make sure that we're fairly sharing the cost of producing food in a more sustainable way? And today, it seems, from my perspective of being an investor in a lot of startup companies, a lot of the technologies are imposed on farmers without clear, sufficient benefit sharing or cost sharing from the system. But that's my opinion. I'd like to hear from you.
I'll try and give that one a crack if if I may. I was fortunate enough, or maybe not, to be able to go to a restaurant just before here in the UK. We went into lockdown, kind of number 3 recently, and I'm vegetarian, and I had a vegetarian option, and my girlfriend picked a meat option. I think there was about 50p difference between the two, and I think that there's when we're looking at different sides of the supply chain, I think that was very indicative of what you were mentioning earlier, Thad, about actually the cost of the embedded cost, whether that be the cost to natural capital or the cost to subsuming various different measurement and management tools that are inevitably going to have to be integrated throughout the supply chain. Where is that cost borne? And it clearly isn't being borne by the consumer at the moment. If I'm paying almost an identical price for a plant-based meal as someone else is for a meal that's with a ruminant animal that has got its own supply chain, you've got it's 1,000 litres of water for every kilogram of beef that's produced here in the UK. So I think that the cost clearly is very much on the farmer at the moment, and that certainly needs addressing moving forward. I think that there stakeholders to move that around the system. I think that there is a willingness from consumers to see a shift, but I think that the real impetus has to come ultimately either from large scale suppliers shifting that cost. But I think actually carbon pricing has a big role to play here. It's often been largely, debatably successful in some areas, but carbon pricing in terms of pricing in the embedded carbon impacts of particular foodstuffs, particular supply chains, and passing that cost through would clearly state the difference when it comes to the cost to the end consumer or to any of the intermediaries of what the impact of that particular foodstuff is.
I'm not entirely sure that we're either qualified or brave enough to answer a lot of these questions, really, because if you think about it, I think anyone working in the food processing industry will say that food is too cheap. I can speak broadly in Europe. I think it's fair to say that post Second World War, food has become too cheap in Europe for what we are, the quality that is being made, and the cost to the earth is not reflected in the price that is being charged. I don't think many technology companies are in any position to alter that sort of dynamic, and I think that that's going to take a mixture of policy and possibly a total restructuring of the entire supply chains, including the way that retail's done. I think that your point about embedded carbon is a very interesting one. I saw a presentation recently by around aquaculture and looking at the price of the footprint of salmon, and obviously with salmon, it's a Norwegian company. They've done a huge amount of work to reduce their own outputs, I beg your pardon, and they'd looked at their logistics. They'd looked at all of these things, and of course the protein feed was the main cause of the problems, but that isn't necessarily reported, whereas they chose to report their entirety of their carbon. And if you look at the ruminant livestock sector, that would actually change the numbers substantially if you looked at the soil carbon associated with the grasslands that the beef are grown on, definitely in Western Europe anyway. So you would get a very different answer from what you might get in feedlot cattle in Central North America, for example. So I guess it's a very, very difficult question, is what I'm saying, and it's very easy to get yourself in a total pickle, I think.
And I think part of it is awareness as well. As consumers become more aware of how their food is produced and what it actually takes to bring it to their table, you know, the more this conversation can start to open up a bit more. You know, if we just look at plant-based milk versus animal milk, you know, there's a huge push towards almond milks and oat milk, and, you know, the sort of production that goes into making almond milk is insane. And the sort of devastating impacts that it can have, even in the soybean industry that's going on, all the way to chocolate and avocados are struggling just because we have this increased demand for these really delicious foods, but we have no real indication of what actually goes into having those crops come to market: water, pollinating, fertilizing, shipping, and delivering those sort of goods. So we think that, you know, that meat is bad or milk is bad and veggies are good. And on, you know, you can debate both sides, I think, but I think as the more we start to understand as consumers the cost, the better off we can start to have these conversations.
So there are a couple of more questions in the chat box. They're very specific with regard to soil health and the use of certain like biochar. Anyone have any knowledge about this area? I want to make a comment.
I was just saying that I am aware of the use of biochar for remediation, and I think there's been substantial amounts of work done in India and throughout some of the African countries. But it's quite a specialist area, and I wouldn't really want to comment too much. But I am aware also of people using the biochar as a way of actually carrying microbes to try and alter the soil microbiome. And I think there's some sort of quite interesting technology being developed in that area, but that's about the limit of my knowledge.
And I can only say I've seen many companies working in this area with different kinds of soil amendments, microbes and different things. And one that was very sort of interesting for us, we do innovation challenges where we try to attract new startups into the space. And we did one last year on manure. So taking livestock manure, but it was from poultry, swine, and dairy. And one of the companies was actually producing biochar from that source. So it becomes interesting even how we can make even livestock production more sustainable by taking some of the waste products that are actually problematic today and turning it into valuable products. It also improves farm incomes, because to me, one of the main things we look for are ways in which we can drive improved farm incomes, which is really undervalued mostly from people who invest in this space.
And I can certainly speak to that point to a certain extent, which is just about, I guess, fertilizers as well. I think sometimes the low tech applications are sometimes the best products out there to a certain extent, and particularly when you're talking about circular economy. The example that I can draw on is that Earth Capital, we manage several anaerobic digestion plants here in the UK, one of which is a farm-based project, so that's based on a dairy farm, so that's fed half with farmyard manure from the dairy cows that then goes in, gets digested. Methanogens then produce carbon dioxide and methane, and that's then used as a fuel in a series of gas engines, and that then generates electricity and heat. Electricity is sold to the national grid. That process produces digestate, which is still very nutrient rich, and that's then spread back on the local farms. That's up in County Durham, and we have another plant based down on the Isle of Wight, and that abates the use of obviously emission intensive nitrogen fertilizers. So sometimes I completely agree, the simplest solutions are sometimes the best.
So I see another question here for Tasha.
So whether it be in terms of partnerships or connections to other farming industries or people within agriculture, or whether a simple understanding of scaling technologies to the level which we're scaling. I think having a kind of supportive group around and a diverse group around is really the ideal situation, at least it's been for us.
Great, thank you. So there were a few questions that were submitted with the registrations, and I thought we would just make sure we cover those. One is around fertilizer a bit more, around nitrogen replacements and nitrogen fixing technology. So anyone have any knowledge or perspectives around that?
I think that I'd like to just comment really in a little bit about the way that we were talking about the biochar. I think this could well be an area of particular interest for current sort of farming areas that have very low yields. So they have an opportunity in a way of, if they can take on sort of new technologies such as the nitrogen fixing, that they can actually sort of leapfrog over rather than following a Western route to try and get their yields up. They can actually do it by using different technologies, and I think that would be really something quite useful. And my understanding is that these technologies often come in the form of simple sort of seed coating type of technologies, which goes back to Joshua's point there, that it's something that's practical and that can be used, and that is particularly helpful if you're considering trying to sort of develop things like that in developing markets, I think.
Yeah, and I think the whole area of the microbiome, both for crop as well as in the animal health space, is growing rapidly. The knowledge of the microbiome is really changing the way in which we see many of these kinds of opportunities, and that's pretty exciting space in itself. The next question was, what role do we see for cellular agriculture? So I take this to mean the alternative protein primarily. And I think it's been brought up, Joshua talked about alternative proteins quite a bit.
I think, well, I actually didn't really know. I was kind of looking at this question slightly skeptically, and then I literally had an email this morning saying a cellular agriculture company was looking to raise 5 million in a round. So it was very, very timely email through this morning. I think that kind of meat alternatives are quite widespread, and I think that cellular agriculture particularly has a role in transitioning pallets in a way, and providing that alternative for people who still wish to get that meat kind of texture, but from a substitute, and particularly if prices begin to reflect the impact that a typical, if we're talking about beef, for instance, that a typical beef farm has or a supply chain has, then that cost could come down. I think the big question around cellular agriculture is scalability, and that's often the challenge. And I'm kind of sticking my neck out slightly, but I don't think that we'll see cellular agriculture in a big way in the market, probably until the latter half of the 2020s, really. But I'm excited by the niche in the market that I think it definitely has. And there are plenty of interesting companies who are doing, making headway in the space.
I think that Joshua's point is absolutely, I agree with him, but I think also you could argue that cellular agriculture, depends on your definition, could even be directed at cellular ways of making the protein for the existing livestock markets or aquaculture or whatever, which of course in many ways would assist with some of the sustainable development goals and stuff, and turn what may not be a perfect supply chain in terms of environmental footprint, but go some way to remediate some of those issues. And I do agree with you, though, that the sort of meat substitutes thing will be, I think it will grow. We have to always remember, I mean, it's a booming industry in many ways, and it's $1 billion market. I think it's 14 billion or something they were saying, but when you compare that with the 1.4 trillion of the livestock sort of the meat market, it doesn't seem that large. But I think it's, if you think about cellular agriculture in its broadest sense, in the sense of both making protein for people and for animals through more conventional husbandry, and also maybe some of the other areas of being slightly smarter and doing it in that way through biotechnology, I guess, in what used to be called biotechnology in old money.
So another question came in here. I think you can all see this around metrics and measurements to improve the food supply chain. And follow on to that question was how to measure. Do we need incentives and policy changes? And we haven't talked too much about policy, and we haven't talked too much about public-private cooperation in this area. So why don't we take this question really from the policy side of it? I've seen some initiatives to try and through different ways of standard setting metrics, whether every one of the major supermarkets, and they're all announcing all kinds of standards, or the sustainability standards, or how they're going to go carbon neutral, and all of these things back into the supply chain. So is this going to be driven by industry, by farmers, by government? Who's going to drive all of this and make it happen?
I would say that retailers are going to play a fairly big part in this. I think policy is going to be potentially a force for good or bad. It'll either stop things happening or encourage them to happen, and hopefully encourage them to happen in the right direction, because obviously we all aware that measuring things is useful as long as you can do something with the information. And equally, information is useful if you can do something with it. So, I mean, I'm always tempted to, if you look at the endocrine disruptor levels, the technology to measure endocrine disruptors has gone ahead of the technology or the ability to actually do something about the generation and the creation of endocrine disruptors. So you know that they're there, but there's nothing you can do about them in many cases. So I think it's really important, if we have measurements, that we make sure that we choose the right measurements to get the right information to actually do something with it. So I'm thinking about if you're looking at getting a technology to replace use-by dates, for example, make sure that you have something that's measuring the right biomarker to tell you whether or not that food has gone off, for example. If you're going to measure carbon of a system, make sure that everybody agrees that the product is measured in the same way, so that you don't have people comparing apples and oranges. So that would be my point, I think.
But one little bit of pushback from me, being the moderator, with regard to being driven by the retailers. The retailers themselves are all very competitive with each other, and may not be setting the same standards, or be setting standards that become increasingly inefficient in the supply chain, because they will go in with their own standards, looking for their own, checking their own things, and at the end of the day makes it more difficult for farmers to check the box.
I didn't say it was necessarily the right solution. I was just saying I thought that was likely to be what it was, and I think that they might well be the people who are doing the pushing. Whether or not they're all pushing in the same direction, and whether they're pushing you in the right direction, I don't know. But that would be just my view of the way that the supply chains work.
I think that's a really interesting point. You within any industry, you're always going to have leaders and laggards. And just thinking back to earlier this summer, within, I guess, fast food supply chains, in particular fast food retailers, I believe it was KFC did their first ever sustainability report. Other fast food chicken shops are available, of course. But KFC did a full report on their chicken supply chain, and I think they fully disclosed levels of disease within their chicken subsuppliers. And I think that was, a really good example about where a retailer has stuck its neck out and said, this is where we are, and put a mark in the sand, and then report against that. Now we have to be really careful that we measure and we don't lose sight of holding KFC to account as to what its targets that it set in summer 2020 were 5 years down the line. So I think that's really important, and there will always be leaders within certain industries, but without any policy to bring the rest in line, I think that will always be the case. So in the financial industry, to take example, initiatives like the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures has been very good about trying to implement levels of disclosure about reporting scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions to do with your financial assets. And alongside that, there's been a lot of European level taxonomy initiatives to try and get people talking the same language, using the same words to mean the same things, which has been very difficult over the past 5 or 10 years when you've been trying to bring people on board, but different things often mean different things in different places as well. So I think that within the food supply chain is going to be very important to move everything forward. And for retailers, there are lots of different technologies out there, particularly platforms these days, that are very good at integrating their own supply chains, helping to manage different stakeholders effectively and better communicate within them. So I think that there are technological solutions, but there's also a big policy shift that needs to happen.
Great.
Yeah,
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to add to that. I think the kind of policy changes, being able to include the farmer in these decisions and more so than ever, I think is quite critical. If we look at just even the berry market, we know that pesticides are bad and we should cut all pesticides, but then we're also leaving the farmers with, well, what do I use now to produce all of these berries that we love to eat? We don't want kind of waste management in the water system, but we love an almond milk latte. How do we start to balance these two sort of ideas and thinking, and bringing it so it makes sense for both sides, really.
Great. Well, I'm conscious of the time. I really appreciate the questions we've gotten from the audience. Panelists, do each of you have one last closing remark, and then we'll ask Hanna to come back. And so we can start the same order we started before. So Jayne?
So my last remark would be that I've given Hanna a set of support mechanisms from both Eit Food and also from within the UK, from the KTN. And I just would say, if anybody's interested in engaging with us in terms of the support that we give for young companies, if you're actually somebody in a young company, or if you're interested in actually having a little look at any of our companies that are going through our programs, I'd be really happy to help. Thank you.
Josh?
I'd just like to highlight, I think just the work that we do at Earth Capital. We typically invest in Series A, Series B investment sizes around kind of 5 to 10 million. So, particularly within the food and ag space, we're very interested in what's going on here at the moment. So we will be looking to make investments in the new year, in kind of Q2 period of time. And I think that just on another level, if anyone would like a conversation, please feel free to reach out. And that this is a fast changing space, and we've certainly been in this for the past 12 years, and are looking forward to where it's going to take us. And I think we all need to continue to be stubborn optimists in the face of all the pressures that we rely on.
And Tasha?
Yeah, I'm also happy to share any of the work that we're doing at Olympia and the ag tech space and pollination in particular. I think having these sort of discussions is quite helpful and key for young companies and technology that we're going to bring out into market and have that kind of understanding. So definitely appreciate the discussion today.
Well, I thank you, panelists. Thank you, CleanEquity, for pulling all this together. Thanks to all of the participants out there who've been viewing and putting the questions to us. And from my side of it, We are also an investor in this space at the earliest stage. We have funds operating in the US, Europe, Latin America, and Asia. So always looking for new ideas, early stage companies that are working to try and make the food supply chain better. Thanks. And Hanna, I think you can close us out.
Thank you very much. Well, a quick and very special thank you to Thad, Jayne, Josh, and Tasha. We're very happy to have had you on. A major thank you as well to everyone who's been joining us on Zoom today, and also everyone joining us through EarthX. We hope to see you in the future as well at the next CleanEquity webinar. So without further ado, happy holidays, everyone. And I hope you had a good hour with us. Thank you very much.